to think that you're going to take guns away from law-abiding citizens and that criminals will not have them, this is an absolutely foolish notion. If we're going to combat crime, we need to combat crime. We don't need to combat law-abiding citizens. You have the entity that we're supposed to be protecting ourselves from deciding who can have a weapon. We don't want the government to have the right to tell us who can and can't have a weapon. That's not what the Second Amendment says. It says shall not be infringed.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for sitting down to discuss Second Amendment issues with me. And here in your hometown of Greensboro, obviously you become very famous recently after a speech that you delivered to the city council, and you were there to speak against the banning of the local gun show. And ever since then, though, that speech went viral. Tell me about that. Did that surprise you how viral that went?
Well, yeah, actually it did. Actually, when I gave the speech, came home, my wife asked me, well, what did you say down at the city council meeting? And I told her, I said, I don't really remember. She said, well, how'd it go? And I said, well, I don't really know. And I was waiting for it to come out on the Greensboro City Council's website. And before that could happen, a group called Grassroots North Carolina put it out on their website. And it got tens of thousands of hits on there. And then one of our representatives, Mark Walker, put it on his website. And that's where it started going viral. And I was shocked. I had no idea it would touch so many people.
So what was the immediate reaction there, say in the auditorium or when you walked out of the auditorium?
Well, after I finished speaking, I figured that I was gonna get jeered. I figured I might get a few, a little applause maybe. But I figured most of what I would get would be jeers because I looked through the crowd and I didn't see very many supporters. But as soon as I got finished speaking, I turned around and I looked and all these people were standing up cheering. And I thought, wow, there are more of us in here than I thought. And I said, that's a good thing. It's a good show of support. But when I left, like I said, I thought it would just be a thing where people would see it and say, hey, that was a pretty good speech. And maybe I'd come home and take it from the city website, put it on my Facebook page, and people would say, hey, pretty cool, but it didn't turn out that way.
Now, what about the city council themselves? Did they relent, or are they going to allow the gun show to continue forward, or is that still to be determined?
Well, as it turns out, they were not. They previously discovered that they could not cancel the gun show. Only the Coliseum director could. And I felt like the meeting they were having that meeting to try to put pressure on him to do so. But since then, I think he's come out and said, no, it's going to go on as usual. So,
why do you think it is that law-abiding gun owners so typically are the ones that are blamed for what happens after a shooting?
I just think it's just an easy target. I think that politicians are split into two camps. I will say three camps on this issue. There are politicians who are pro-Second Amendment, and they have their stance, and they know, they realize that people should have their rights. And then you have a group of people who are well-meaning but misinformed on the issue. A lot of times they're not even misinformed. As a matter of fact, sometimes I'm just going to use the term, matter of fact, they're just lazy. And they just look for the easiest solution and the easiest target that's going to get them the most support. And then you have another group of politicians that I believe that are doing this intentionally because they intentionally want to change our Constitution. So I think that's really the issue with politicians. I think there's the ones that are against our gun rights are, like I said, many of them are just complacent and just doing it just for votes. And then other ones are doing it to actually change our Constitution, which is not good.
So do you sense there is a war against gun owners and the Second Amendment and gun rights in our country?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the people who mean this country no good, I think some of the leftist politicians, not liberals, but leftists, some of them are just downright socialists, and I think some of them just may be communists. But I think those folks are actively trying to end what I call our citizen arsenal, because they know that's the only thing that stands in the way of total domination by our government. And when the framers put that Second Amendment in place, that's what they put it in place for. A lot of people talk about hunting, we talk about self-defense and things like that. But what that Second Amendment is actually for is to protect us from our own government. Politician loses a race and doesn't want to come out of office, we have the means to go get him out of office. So it's very important for us to keep that amendment in place.
It really is, and we've seen in recent weeks and months calls to repeal the Second Amendment, even in some extreme cases, confiscating firearms. But that being said, how effective do you think that would be, putting gun restrictions in place to keep firearms supposedly out of the hands of criminals? How effective do you think that would be?
Well, see, a lot of people try to compare us to other countries. I've seen one popular video that talks about Australia's gun laws and how they got rid of guns after a mass shooting and blah, 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 blah. But the problem is, this is not Australia. The United States is a completely unique country. Australia, for the most part, is a homogenous society. It's made up of Australians. America is made up of everybody. All across this is a huge nation. And to think that you're going to take guns away from law-abiding citizens and that criminals will not have them, that's the most foolish notion. It's an absolutely foolish notion. Criminals are going to get guns. And if they don't get guns, as we see in the UK, they're going to get knives. And when they can't get knives, they're going to get acid. And when they can't get acid, they're going to get trucks full of diesel fuel and ammonium nitrate. So what I really feel like is this, is if we're going to combat crime, we need to combat crime. We don't need to combat law-abiding citizens. We need to go after the criminals. And I said this to another group. America should stay unique. We should use American ingenuity and American know-how and American determination to figure out how to avoid these criminal actions while at the same time letting all law-abiding American citizens keep their rights.
Now, why do you think gun ownership is so important?
Well, like I said, that's it. I think that you look back at history, one particular quote comes to mind from World War II. I think it was a Japanese general said if they attacked this country, there would be a gun behind every blade of grass, which would have been true. It would have been suicide because the citizens were armed and ready to use their weapons. And I believe that's one of the reasons. But like I said, the main reason I believe that the Second Amendment should stay in place is because just because of the fact that we should have the option, if we want to exercise that right, to go out and buy a weapon to protect ourselves, whether that be from criminals or the government. It needs to stay there. I personally don't own a firearm right now. I'm planning on owning one pretty soon. But just because I don't own a firearm now doesn't mean I won't need one in the future or want one in the future. I don't have a lawyer now either. But like I said, if I wake up tomorrow and need a lawyer, I'd hate to find out that my right to counsel had been taken away. So those rights need to stay in place no matter what.
So that's really amazing. You're not yet a gun owner, and yet there's this passion that you have for our Constitution and the Second Amendment. Where does that come from?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from a sense of fair play that I've had since my childhood. It's just simply not fair to punish people who haven't done anything for what someone else did. It would be like if my neighbor drove drunk and killed someone and the police come and take my car. It's just simply not fair. And like I said, it's a lazy and ineffective way to fight crime, and it's a lazy and ineffective way to govern. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from. And of course, a lot of it comes from the fact that I believe the Constitution is the greatest document ever written by man. It's a wonderful instrument, and I think if we start fooling around with it and changing it, we're going to find ourselves losing the freedoms that we have. And once that happens, we're going to find ourselves in a bad situation.
I've heard you say, you've spoken about the fact that the Second Amendment is about freedom, and the Second Amendment really is the ultimate guarantee of our freedom. And, you've also said that gun owners are the majority. They're very law-abiding people. To that, concealed carriers are also extremely law-abiding. In fact, they're one of the most law-abiding segments of our society. Even statistically speaking, even more so than police. Why do you think that is, that concealed carriers and gun owners tend to be so law-abiding?
Well, I think legal gun owners, I think they universally share one thing: responsibility. And responsibility is one of the biggest components that's oftentimes overlooked in our freedom. If without responsibility, you are not going to have your freedom for long. And then that goes from the top to the bottom. And I think when you see people who conceal carry and people that own guns, oftentimes they have a high degree of responsibility. I know all of the people that I know that own guns are very responsible with them. Some of my friends who own guns have had small children in the house, and they take every measure they can to make sure those children don't get a hold of those guns. So I think that's what it boils down to. These people understand how vital it is and what a privilege it is to own these weapons, and they understand the responsibility that goes with them. And I believe that's why they take care of them so well.
Mm-hmm. You know, shifting gears a little bit, in past years, we've seen situations where law and order breaks down. You know, Los Angeles riots or the Ferguson riots, or after a Hurricane Katrina or something like that. A natural calamity like a Katrina. In light of those type of things, do you think it's wise for law-abiding citizens to rely solely on the police for their protection?
Absolutely not. That's a classic example. The riots out in Los Angeles after the Rodney King verdict. There was a very good meme that was on social media of a Korean man standing in front of his business, and he's holding an AR-15 with that 30-round clip. And he said, the caption said, "Here's the reason you need a 30-round clip and an AR-15." And that's someone else described it to me like this: the police and firemen, they're the second responders. Whenever there's an emergency in the home, your first responder is you. If there's a fire breaks out in this home right now, as it's my responsibility to get my family out of here, to call the fire department to respond. If somebody breaks in here, it's my responsibility to avoid that person or put that person down if I can. So we're our own first responders in every situation. The police are not stationed outside my door. If someone breaks in here and I've got a weapon, I've got to defend myself. So we have to be our own first responders when the situation first arises. So owning a firearm, or if you want to exercise that right, it should be your right, and we should be able to keep it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that we really are the first responders. And that's one of the things that's so dangerous about gun control laws, is it makes it difficult for people to protect themselves. And one of the very popular gun control proposals in the country today is what's known as universal background checks. And I'm sure you're familiar with that and heard of those. But basically, under a system like that, all gun sales in the country, including private sales, would be banned unless you go get government permission first. You know, you get screening from the government first. But of course, that also then means we essentially will have a universal registration system. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you could speak to that, just in terms of what are the dangers of having a universal registration system?
It defeats the purpose of the Second Amendment. You have the entity that we're supposed to be protecting ourselves from deciding who can have a weapon. So it just blatantly you might as well just get rid of the Second Amendment, because you think about it. You think about the myriad of excuses they could give you not to give a gun. Oh, you're a veteran. You might have PTSD. Oh, you went through a divorce 2 weeks ago. You might still be suffering from effects of that. Oh, you had surgery on your pinky toe, and you still might be suffering the effects of your anesthesia. I mean, the government can come up with any excuse it wants to keep you from owning a firearm. So they're going to meet their own needs. If they're trying to end our rights, and they could tell us who can and can't have a weapon, I mean, it's like almost the same thing that happened in Germany under the Weimar Republic. I mean, the Weimar Republic did the same thing, National Gun Registry, and then Adolf Hitler used that National Gun Registry to disarm his any potential enemies. So I mean, the same thing could happen here. I mean, we don't want the government to have the right to tell us who can and can't have a weapon. That's not what the Second Amendment says. It says shall not be infringed. And it's kind of hard for me to understand what part of that they don't understand.
Well, Mark, you've brought up some historical examples, and I know that you're a lover of history. And so I'd like to ask you actually some historical type questions, especially related to our founding. For example, in the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers said that our rights are endowed by our Creator. Right. In other words, our rights come from God, they don't come from the government. Could you just address that, like why that's an important distinction?
Well, I think that's one of the problems that we have in this country now that people don't understand, and they don't understand the beauty of our founding documents. I can't think of any other country on earth that's ever allowed that to exist. They're saying that, you have this God-given right, these God-given rights, and nobody can take those rights away from you. It also goes into, I believe, what's causing some of these shootings. The removal of God from the public square. Not only has he been removed from this conversation about our founding documents, but he's been removed from the public square, period. I find it so ironic that in these school shootings, in these schools, you can't, they don't want God, they don't want the Bible, they don't want prayer. But then as soon as there's a mass shooting, seems like the first person they call on is God, the very person they kicked out of the arena. I think that issue touches on the basic problem, because we don't have a gun problem in this country. What we have is a heart problem. And I know my pastor talks about this all the time. When your heart is not right, you may have what he calls a God problem. And I think in a lot of areas in our country, we have that problem with God because we've just dismissed him completely. And we've dismissed his importance and his role in our rights. And I think if we could find a way to bring God back into the conversation in a meaningful way and understand that our rights do come from him, I think we'll see a lot of this stuff stop.
Well, I'm glad we could do a little bit of that here, and you're obviously very passionate about that. How do you think we can better address that?
Well, I think it's going to have to be a grassroots movement. It's going to have to come person to person, family to family, schoolmate to schoolmate. People are going to have to just get out in the streets and start talking about it and not be afraid anymore. I think there are a lot of people who are afraid to profess their faith. They think they're going to be seen as hypocritical, or I like to tell people like this. I don't need Jesus because I'm perfect. I need him because I'm not perfect. And I think that people have to understand that we do need God. Without God, this country, I don't believe, would exist. And I think that that's how it's got to start. It's got to start with people not being afraid to stand up and proclaim their faith. And it's got to start person to person, family to family, schoolmate to schoolmate.
Well, and certainly the framers weren't afraid, and they stated very clearly, our rights do come from God, and therefore our rights, they said, are inalienable. In other words, they can't be taken away. And I think you've addressed that. And you see that theme carried over into the Constitution. And you addressed this earlier. The last four words of the Second Amendment says, shall not be infringed. What kind of abuses do you think that the Founding Fathers were trying to prevent in stating so strongly the language shall not be infringed?
Exactly what we're seeing today. Exactly what we're seeing from the leftists today. They use underhanded, sneaky tactics. They pull at people's heartstrings. They put out divisive messages. That was one of the things that the city council enraged me so bad. I mean, every person, it seemed like that got up had their own private agenda. Nobody was standing up saying, "Hey, what about everybody's rights?" They were talking about this group and that group, and I think that's what the founders knew. That the founders knew that if anybody tried to subvert our government, they were going to do it from within, and they were going to do it by sneaky, underhanded means that would deceive people. And I think that's why it's so strongly worded in the Second Amendment that it shall not be infringed, because they knew that people would eventually try to infiltrate our government and take over and become tyrannical. And when that happens, the people need to be able to rise up if need be.
So, as far as our response as concerned citizens, is there any room for compromise when it comes to Second Amendment rights or any God-given right?
I don't know. It's not. It's not. The Constitution needs to be left in place just like it is. But as far as taking away any of these rights, absolutely not. That's an absolute no-no.
So, what should be the response of law-abiding Americans if and when government tries to take away their firearms?
I think that there are enough people in this country that will know when it's happening, and I really believe that they'll rise up and they will do what's necessary to remove any political entity that's trying to take this country over and change it to anything that it shouldn't be, or trying to become tyrannical over the people. I think there are people that will rise up and do the right thing. I pray that it'll never come to that. I pray that we can turn this thing around peacefully and stop these gun grabbers and stop these leftists. And I'm just going to tell you the truth. I'd like to see every one of them run out of this country. If you don't love this country, there's no need to stay here. There's plenty of places you can go and live and be abused if you'd like to. But this is not the place. So I really would like to see this country turned around. I pray it never comes to that. But if it does, I believe that there are people that are ready to stand in the breach.
You know, in talking about disarmament, when you look at the history of gun control around the world, but also in this country as well, it's often been the attempt by one group to disarm another group. You know, in New York, there was what was called the Sullivan Law, which was an attempt to disarm the Italian immigrants. Or you look at the black codes and Jim Crow laws after the Civil War, where they were disarming the newly freed slaves or making it very difficult for them to own firearms. And even as late as the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, you saw examples where police were disarming law-abiding blacks. Why do you think that the right to keep and bear arms, which is protected in our Second Amendment, has come under such fierce attack throughout our history?
I think the same tyrannical people who commit all those acts are the same people we're dealing with now. The same type of people. They're just called something different. You call them Marxist socialists, you call them communists, you can call them whatever. They have the same nefarious purpose. They want to rule over people with tyrannical rule and don't want people to be able to question them. The only way that's possible is to disarm people. If people are disarmed, you can do whatever you want to do to them. You can line them up, take them off into the woods and shoot them, or you can throw them in the camps, whatever you want to do without a fight. But I believe that's what they want. And I, you know, people might argue with that and say, no, there's nobody in our government that wants to do that. But I truly believe that there are people in our government right now, if they could, they would take the Constitution and tear it up and replace it with something else. And we just simply can't let that happen.
You know, I think one of the misnomers of the civil rights era was that they were all pacifist. And I love that the testimony of Condoleezza Rice, of course, Bush's first Secretary of State, talking about how her daddy would help patrol the neighborhood because the Southern police departments, even though the KKK was attacking them in the nights, they were looking the other way. They were allowing it to happen. And her daddy would patrol with a shotgun with other guys in the community.
Yes. I hate that narrative. You see that narrative in the mass media all the time, in movies and television shows. It's such paternal racism that you turn this entire class of people into these weaklings. We're just so helpless, we can't do anything. And then you start reading these historical accounts of these people, how they stood up to the Klan, how they stood up to these vicious racists. And you start saying these people weren't victims, they were victors. If they were victims if they were victims instead of victors, they would still be in bondage. You know, history would have been different. They had to stand up and fight. And I think it does a great disservice. College campuses that don't teach the truth and these movies and television shows that preach these lies, it does a great disservice to our country and our history.
Now, it seems like there's been a resurgence, and recent media reports have been saying that there's been an upswing in the African American community in terms of purchasing firearms, owning firearms. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think just overall, I think a lot of Black Americans are beginning to realize that all along they have been conservative. And I think they're starting to come out of the, quote, shadows. And they're starting to not be afraid to proclaim what they believe, because there's a lot of peer pressure to go along with the crowd. But I think more and more Black Americans are saying, look, I believe in this. I believe in the Constitution. I don't believe in abortion. I believe in God. I believe in fiscal responsibility for our government, and that's it. If anybody doesn't like it, that's too bad. And I think that's got a lot to do with that uptick.
So I'd be curious to hear your personal experience. Have you been able to talk to others in the Black community about Second Amendment and gun rights, and what is the reaction that you've gotten?
Well, it's mixed. It's mixed. I've on social media, I found myself, I've lost quite a few friends over political differences. But one thing that I do find that we find common ground on is a lot of social issues, which is one of the things that confuses me. A lot of Black Americans do not agree with abortion. They don't necessarily agree with same-sex marriage. They don't want their constitutional rights taken away, their right to bear arms taken away. But then a lot of them will go and vote for politicians who support the very things that they don't want. Mm-hmm. So I think what it's a matter of, again, it's going to have to be an organic grassroots movement. That's going to have conversations are going to have to take place from person to person, and church leaders and educators that are really going to have to start coming out of shadows and not being afraid to proclaim what they really believe.
That's great. In closing, I just wanted to address the issue, just in recent weeks, we've seen the most extraordinary thing, because we've seen young people marching for the limitation of their rights, wanting to see their constitutionally protected Second Amendment rights restricted. And I was hoping you'd be able to speak from your heart to that, as a man, as a father, as a grandfather, as an American. What would you say to that generation that right now there are many of them, perhaps not a majority, but certainly many of them, and they've gotten a lot of praise by the media? What would you say to them about their desire to have their rights restricted?
Actually, I actually wouldn't say anything to them. I would simply tell them you don't know any better. The people that I would like to talk to, the people that I would like to speak to, are the people that are committing the dastardly act of using these children as political human shields. These kids are nothing but pawns. That's all they are. They take these kids, put them in the street, have them protest, because they know that people are going to shy away from criticizing them, or they're going to shy away from saying anything bad because it's children. I'm not going to do that. If a David Hogg or this Emily Gonzalez, if any child like that thinks that they're going to step up to me as an adult and tell me the way things are going to be, I'm going to do the same thing to them that adults would have done to me in my day, which is put me back in my place. They need to be put back in their place. They need to be told, you're a child, you need to stay in a child's place, and you need to let adults handle this. Because as we see, when adults tried to come up with solutions to the problems at their school, they still cried. They still cried foul. So I really wouldn't speak to the children so much. The ones I'd like to speak to are the leftists and the socialists who put them out there. Those are the people that I would really like to speak to.
I'd like to see you do that too.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you very much again for having me in to speak to you. And I have actually one more thing that I want to present to you as a thank you. We want to present to you a life membership in Gun Owners of America. And it's a thank you for the leadership that you've exerted. You took it upon yourself to go down to that city council and address them. You didn't just, a lot of people might not do that. They might just say, oh, that's too bad, and and hope that somebody else address it. But you've exerted tremendous leadership, and your voice is being heard all over the world and even translated into other languages.
Yes.
So anyway, we just wanted to thank you for what you've done and present you with this life membership.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.